It's recording.
All right, hello, Dr. Magyari. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
I understand that in your career, you were a bodybuilder.
I was at the beginning of my career.
What was your inspiration for that? How did you get into it?
That's an interesting story because my father was a jockey, a really little man. And I was very small when I was in high school, and my 9th grade science teacher was also the wrestling coach. And one of the experiments he had us do as part of the science class was all the students went down to the fitness center at our high school, and we were asked to lift our body weight as many times as we can. Most people couldn't lift their body weight at all, but I was able to lift double my body weight. And I was very small. I was only about 90 pounds when I was in 9th grade.
Wow.
So I was really small. But my science teacher said that even the football players on the team couldn't lift just a little bit more than their body weight. They couldn't lift double their body weight. And so he told me that I was a freak, that there was something different about me that was really different.
And that inspired you?
It did, because I had never lifted weights before, and to be able to lift like that, he said there was something genetically different. And so I started lifting and I got really strong.
So this time period was during the 70s?
This was in the 70s. I
And
graduated high school in 1976, so this would have been like 72, 73, somewhere around there.
And during that time, wasn't bodybuilding beginning to gain a lot of recognition?
It was. That was the time when Arnold Schwarzenegger was one of the people winning big events in bodybuilding, and he was a very popular guy, so bodybuilding began getting a lot of recognition.
Would you say he was like your primary role model for that?
I would say he was, yes.
It's so, like, how did you exactly, after you lifted your body weight, did you actually get a coach to keeping fit and gaining muscle, or how did you actually get into it as a career?
Okay, so I didn't really start bodybuilding at that time, but I was interested in doing resistance training and resistance exercise. And when I started doing resistance exercise, I started to grow really fast. And so for somebody who was really small, getting bigger I felt really good about that.
Good.
And even though my dad didn't like it because that meant I couldn't be a jockey anymore, and I grew up with horses, and he wanted me to be a jockey. It still made me happy because I preferred being bigger and a little more muscular than being the littlest guy.
Did you meet a lot of resistance from your parents?
No, not really. My dad was just a little disappointed that I wasn't going to be a jockey, but they always supported me. So in high school, I was on the wrestling team, and as being part of the wrestling team, we did resistance training. And so I got a little bigger and a little stronger. I think my first year in 9th grade, I wrestled in 10th grade, I was 98 pounds. That's the lightest weight class, so that's what I wrestled. I wasn't that big. I weighed less than 98. Then when I started lifting more, my junior year, I got up to about 112. I wrestled 112, 119. And my senior year, I wrestled at 126 pounds. So that was, even though that still seems pretty small, for me, I was starting to gain weight pretty fast, and most of that was muscle weight.
Wow, and after you had been into that, when was the moment where you considered, I want to do bodybuilding, like I want to get serious with this?
So it wasn't until after I graduated from high school and I started lifting more consistently at a real gym. The high school gym we had at our high school just had one piece of equipment that was like a multi-station piece of equipment, and it wasn't that much. When I finally joined my first gym and I saw what there was available in a real gym, it got me more motivated to exercise more, and I started to meet people who were much bigger and who were competing in both bodybuilding or powerlifting. And when I first started, I started as a powerlifter, so more for strength than for size.
And those are the ones that lift and then they drop the huge barbell?
No, that's Olympic lifting. So powerlifting, there's 3 lifts. There's a bench press, a squat, and a deadlift. Those are the 3 power lifts. So when you go to a powerlifting meet, those are the 3 lifts you compete in.
Yeah.
So, and bench press was always my strongest lift, but.
And do you still to this day have friends from that era?
I do still have friends from that era. I don't see them as frequently as I talk to them maybe once a year or something like that. Catch up on,
and they
reminisce about old stories. Yeah, most of the guys that I was training with are no longer competing. I'm 54 years old now, so there's not too many guys that are 54 that are still competing actively. Is there an age limit? No, there's not really an age limit. There are some guys that can compete. Most guys start dropping off. Their competitiveness starts dropping off in the late 40s. So there are very few guys competing nationally that are over 40 years old, 45 years old.
Oh,
Definitely not 54 years old.
Who knows?
Yeah.
There's also a lot of controversy associated with steroids in the bodybuilding world. Were you ever a part of that movement?
Yeah, so back, like I started in the 70s, the late 70s and early 80s is when I was doing most of my competition. I had won the Mr. Southern States bodybuilding competition in 1983, and so that was my first big competition, and after I won that contest I was training for the American Nationals. That's when I started meeting people. You know, I met people that were taking anabolic steroids right from when I first started bodybuilding, but I really wasn't that interested in it because I was gaining strength and size relatively quickly.
Yeah,
so I was getting bigger and stronger without steroids. I didn't really need to use anabolic steroids. But once I got to that level where I was going to be competing on a national level, and I had already gained, by that time I was 190, almost 200 pounds. So starting, but that was over 8 or 10 years of gaining 10 pounds a year. And that's about how much I gained. So after 10 years, you know, I was getting close to 200 pounds. And to get any bigger, to compete on a national scale, there was a lot more incentive to use anabolic steroids, I should say. But the interesting thing was, and a lot of people don't understand now, is I was introduced to anabolic steroids by my family physician. I got steroids from my family doctor.
Wow.
And so it wasn't until 1984 that the American Medical Association discouraged physicians from prescribing anabolic steroids as an ergogenic aid or for athletic purposes.
Oh, so you didn't do it at all illicitly, like
no,
now?
not through the black market, no. So it was with my family physician. And it wasn't until later in the 1980s and almost till 1990 when the government made using anabolic steroids a controlled substance. So for most people who are young now, their whole lives they've grown up knowing anabolic steroids as being illegal or banned. But back in the 70s and early 80s, a lot of athletes got their anabolic steroids from their family physicians. The good thing about that was when my family physician gave me anabolic steroids, every 3 weeks I had to get a blood test to make sure that my liver functions were normal, everything was going. Plus I got counseling as to what to expect from anabolic steroids and what to expect when I went off of anabolic steroids. They help you get bigger, stronger, faster, but when you go off, they were given to me in cycles of 12-week cycles. So usually the 12 weeks before my big competition, I would take the anabolic steroids and then go off until the next time I was going to compete again. Now guys use steroids to get big. Back then we used them to maintain mass while we were dieting for a competition, so you could maintain your muscle size and get very lean at the same time. And with the physician's help, that was fairly easy to do.
Did they make you feel difference in heart palpitations or anything associated with steroid use?
Oh, I didn't have any of those feelings. There's obvious feelings that you get psychological changes with anabolic steroids. They make you more aggressive, give you much more confidence physically in your abilities. But I think for me, I'm a very mild-mannered person normally. So when I took anabolic steroids, I could feel that I was a little bit more aggressive, but I was still able to control that. But I did have friends that I trained with who were aggressive to begin with.
Oh.
And when they used anabolic steroids, they would not be able to control their aggression if they got angry. And that's where you hear about some of the roid rage stories that you hear. And so people who are aggressive naturally, who would take anabolic steroids, would just become more aggressive. And that could be dangerous if you're starting out being aggressive.
Yeah, and now since it's controlled and people often have to resort to the black market, what is your take on that?
So having been in competing on a national level, I knew a lot of people who were involved in the black market. I actually had friends who sold anabolic steroids in the black market. Not to me, but they did sell them. And so I understood that how they operated. And essentially, he would buy the cheapest steroids he could get from outside of the U.S. and label them himself and put whatever label on it was the popular drug at the time, but it would always be the exact same drug, no matter what he sold it as. He would buy a real cheap testosterone, like testosterone enanthate or testosterone cypionate, which he could get for pennies, and sell it for $20 or $30 a dose. And so since I knew that's what was happening, I wasn't really interested in being involved in that at all, because you have no idea what it is you get when you buy on the black market. The people are just trying to make.
Into your body.
You don't even know what the drug is. He would label, he would make his own cartons whatever the popular drug for bodybuilding was at the time, that's what he would label the carton. He would make the exact same carton as if you were to buy it from a pharmacy. But the other thing is, when it became illegal to sell anabolic steroids, for physicians to prescribe anabolic steroids for athletic purposes, the type of steroids that were being made back then are completely different than the type of steroids that are being made now. There's two aspects to anabolic androgenic steroids, and one is the anabolic side of that, which is tissue promoting or muscle growth aspect, and the other is the androgenic aspect of testosterone, which is the male enhancing characteristics. And so the drugs that were designed back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s were designed to enhance the anabolic side of that and to diminish the androgenic effects of testosterone. Well, when that and starting in 1984, all of those types of drugs were taken off of the market, and now the only drugs that are out there are actually the androgenic type drugs, but still have a small anabolic property to them. And so that's why I hear people now talking about taking drugs. They're taking 100 tablets a day, and when I would take from my physician maybe 1 tablet a day, or an injection of 1 cc a week. Here guys taking a cc a day. It's because the drugs that they're getting now are not the same drugs that were available when there was it was legal to prescribe those type of drugs.
Yeah, and also not just steroids now in athletics, also blood doping is a common practice. And I think, what do you think, you know, what's your opinion on athletes who resort to those methods? Do you think it's taken the sport out of everything?
You know, there's a lot of controversy as to people who are adamant about both sides of that being, you know, people who are born with high levels of red blood cells and that have a high VO2 naturally. A lot of people say that that's a disadvantage for people who are born genetically don't have that, and if they could take a substance that would put them on a level playing field, that's the fair side of the equation. If everybody starts out with the same number of red blood cells, or if everybody starts with the same aerobic capacity, then how hard a person trains is going to determine who's going to win, and not necessarily your genetics. On the other side of that, there's the people who believe that genetics are what should determine who's going to win. If you're born with the genetic, you know, potential to be a champion, then you're the one who's going to be a champion. Obviously, those who aren't born with those genetics feel differently.
That is true.
So, you know, I'm not sure which one of those I think is correct. I don't like to see people using drugs outside of the care of a physician, and if that's the way it's being done, then I would not recommend that for anybody.
That is true. Also, when did you decide to quit with the bodybuilding?
In 1984, when they made anabolic steroids became illegal to get from a physician. Most of the competitors back then, at the Nationals, they said they were going to start drug testing at the Nationals to make sure that everybody had quit using anabolic steroids. Well, by 1986, they had not started drug testing yet, and I quit taking anabolic steroids when it became illegal to get it from my physician. And so then I was competing against people who were not getting tested, who were pretty adamant about talking out front and say they were still using them. And it was hard to compete against people who are using anabolic steroids when you're not and still do well. Although I still placed 7th at the American Nationals in 1986 without anabolic steroids, which meant, you know, to be in the top 10 is still good. But you know, obviously I wanted to be 1 or 2, and 7th wasn't good enough for me. So if the government wasn't going to start, or if the contest promoters weren't going to start testing at the contest to make sure that people weren't still using them, then I wasn't going to continue to compete in that sport anymore. So I quit competing in 1986.
Oh, with that in mind, what do you do to keep fit today?
I still exercise every single day. I do either I ride a bike for an hour a day, or I go over to the fitness center and do resistance training for an hour a day. I prefer resistance exercise. That's what I like, because that's what I'm good at.
I like that too.
Still, a few years ago, I competed in the powerlifting contest here at UNF, and at 50 years old, I still won that competition against all the students here. So even as an old man, I still have a fairly good strength.
That is great. What do you, as a closing to the interview, what would you advise young athletes who want to do resistance training today?
You can still get big and strong without anabolic steroids. It just takes longer. You know, the problem with a lot of young kids today, they just want everything now. But like I said, I was able to gain about 10 pounds a year And over 10 years, that was able to gain about close to 100 pounds of muscle on my body over 10 years without anabolic steroids. And it wasn't until I got to that level where I was competing on a national level that I started to use anabolic steroids. But back then, like I said, that was a legal thing. It was legal, not illegal.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Magyari. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.